So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chris Berg. I'm the Director of Libraries here at MIT, and it is a great honor to welcome you all to this conversation about race and racism with Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum and Dean Melissa Nobles. You'll see on the slide up here that we will have this conversation in this room, but we'll also able to have this conversation online. There is a hashtag, if you are so inclined, MIT Talks Race. This talk is also being live streamed because we had so many people who wanted to come that we couldn't fit them all in this room with us. So this will be a virtual reality conversation as well. This event has suffered from an embarrassment of riches in terms of sponsors and supporters of this event. So I'd like to thank them all, but I know you all don't want to hear me talk too much. You want us to get to the main event, so you know who you are. Thank you to everyone who has supported this and the units across campus who have sponsored this event. It's really a testament to the level of commitment and enthusiasm for having these hard conversations about race and racism that we have across this campus and across so many units here. I want to put in a plug for a program called MIT Reads. So the libraries started this program, I think, several years ago. And the book, Dr. Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, is our spring selection for MIT Reads. MIT Reads is a campus-wide reading program. It's sponsored by the libraries. This is our third year of doing it. And the intention here is to build understanding and build community through the act of reading, right? And through the act of reading, individuals come into conversation and community with the author. So the reader has a conversation with the author with the reader. And then through MIT Reads, we try to encourage conversation amongst the readers as well. And we believe that that can lead to greater understanding about topics and lead to a better and more cohesive community here at MIT. And so it's a big part of why we promote reading at MIT as a community endeavor through MIT Reads. We have two community discussions about the book this semester, in addition to this afternoon's presentation. So on April 19th at noon, we have a discussion, and then April 24th at 5:30. You can learn more about the program, future books and events. You can sign up for our email list. I'm told to make sure I tell you all that it's a very low traffic email list, don't worry. You won't get inundated, but you can sign up for all of that. And you can buy a copy of Dr. Tatum's book outside this hall right after the event. And actually, Dr. Tatum will be signing copies if you would like. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dean Melissa Nobles. And let me read you a bio of our very own Dean Nobles. So Melissa Nobles is the Keenan Sahan Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at MIT. Her research and teaching have focused on the comparative study of racial and ethnic politics and issues of retrospective justice. Her current research centers on constructing a database of racial killings in the American South from 1930 to 1954. She's the author of two books, Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics, and The Politics of Official Apologies. She's the co-editor of Inherited Responsibility and Historical Reconciliation in East Asia, and her scholarship has appeared in numerous journals and edited books. Nobles is a graduate of Brown University, where she majored in history. She also received an MA and PhD in political science from Yale University. She has held fellowships at Boston University's Institute for Race and Social Division, Harvard University's Radcliffe Center for Advanced Study, and is an advisory board member of Northeastern Law School's Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Law Clinic. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the conversation over to Dean Nobles and Dr. Tatum.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to have such a great audience, and I'm expecting a ton of participation. So there's one key question that's motivating this conversation this afternoon, which is where are we as a country in having honest conversations about race and racism? 22 years ago, in the seminal work that is being read by all of you all, by Dr. Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It was published. And in this conversation today, the 20th anniversary of the book was in 2017. We want to have an opportunity to discuss with Dr. Tatum her views on what's transpired over the 20 years since its publication, and to give us an assessment of where we are today. And I guess one of the questions we should be asking is, are we better or worse off than we were 20 years ago? And also, how can we as an institution here at MIT, and as a country, what more can we do to create a more equitable institute and society? But before getting to the conversation, I want to provide some words of introduction for Dr. Tatum. So Dr. Tatum is the president emerita of Spelman College. Her visionary leadership as the 9th president, she served from 2002 to 2015, was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. She's a recognized expert in race relations and an author of the bestseller, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race. She was the 2014 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contribution to Psychology. Earlier, in 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for her innovative leadership in the field of education. She earned her BA in psychology from Wesleyan University, and her MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, and an MA in religious studies from the Hartford Seminary. So first, welcome, Dr. Tatum.
Well, thank you.
Welcome to MIT.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I've got just a few questions. And I thought maybe the first would be giving you an opportunity to think about these past 20 years, as I thought about. So you've researching the new book, and in your introduction, you say a lot about what's going on. And so I wonder if you would tell us something about your views and what are the surprising findings that you may have had over the past 20 years. And has anything changed about your thinking about racism itself?
Sure. Well, let me say I'm happy to be here. Very delighted to be having this conversation with you and all of you here in the audience, so thank you for coming. And I am going to answer your question about, the last 20 years, what's different, what's not. But I want to start by getting some information from the audience, if I might.
You may.
So I want to start because it's relevant to your question. So I would like everyone here to just take a moment and think about your own earliest race-related memory. I'm not going to ask you to tell it, so there's no risk. I just want you to think about it. And raise your hand if you've thought of something. Okay, almost your hand is up. And so the question I have is, how old were you at the time of the thing you have just recalled? So you can either call out ages or hold up fingers. Okay, a lot of fives are up. 5, I've got some 10s, 7, 8, 5, 6, a lot of 6s, 5s, 9. So a lot of people, not everyone of course, but a lot of people have a memory that goes back to what I'm going to call the early elementary years. 5, 6, 7, early elementary school. Maybe, did anybody have a memory younger than 5? Sometimes we get people as young as 3. Okay, we've got a couple hands up, 4. So it could even be preschool or kindergarten age, but many people have an early elementary memory. So the next question is, what emotion, if any, is attached to the thing you've recalled? You have to call it out. Anger, I heard somebody say shocking, confusion, curiosity, shame, aberration, admiration. Okay, admiration, curiosity, confusion, anger, shame. What else? Fear. Interest, which could also be curiosity. Yeah. Okay, so sometimes people say sadness. I haven't heard that one yet. Or embarrassment. Sometimes people say isolating, feel, depending on your memory. It doesn't have to be an unpleasant memory if it's of interest or admiration. Sometimes people say love or happiness because it's in the context of a friendship or something like that. But for a lot of people, the emotion is uncomfortable in some way. I'd just like you to raise your hand if you would describe whatever you experienced as uncomfortable in some way. Okay, a lot of uncomfortable. So now the question is, did you have a conversation with a concerned adult, a teacher or a parent, at the time that this incident occurred? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, you look around, you'll see maybe we've got 20 hands up total. Raise your hand if you did not. Many more did not. So I have one more thing to ask about it. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, okay, so now the question is, how many of you know some 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds? You know, cousins, siblings, your own children, kids you babysat for. You have some experience with 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And tell me if you agree with this statement. They are pretty candid. They don't filter much, right? You know, children of that age don't filter much. So I always find it interesting to talk to an audience full of adults like this one. Ask them if they have an early memory. They say yes. Ask them how old they were. They say 5, 6, 7. Ask them if it was uncomfortable. They say yes. They tell me about that discomfort. And then you ask them, did you tell anybody? And they say no, which is counterintuitive based on what we know about 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And so what that tells me is that many people, like the people in this room and like the people in most auditoriums where I'm speaking, have learned at an early age not to talk about those experiences. Even though they haven't learned to filter, they've learned not to talk about that. And so when you ask me about the last 20 years, what I can tell you is I get the same answers today as I got 20 years ago.
Oh, boy.
And one of the reasons I might still be getting the same answers is because we learn early not to talk about race, and certainly not to talk about racism, and you can't solve a problem if you can't talk about it.
Right. So that leads to my next question, which is, how can we have these kind of conversations, right? I mean, we want to have,
Yes.
the adults are here wanting to have honest conversations.
Yes.
So how can we do that?
Well, you have to, you have to start. Well,
Here we go, Beverly.
Yeah. I think of this, I have to tell you the image that came to my mind when you asked me this question.
Yeah.
I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. My father taught at Bridgewater State University, was then Bridgewater State College. And at Bridgewater State, there is a swimming pool that is open in the summer for use by community members, and my friends and I used to ride our bikes to the pool and go to free swim. And there was a high diving board, and you could, get in line for your turn to jump off the high diving board. And I used to get in that line and, wait my turn, and then I'd be up at the diving board, and all the kids are lined up behind me, and the only way off is to jump, right? The only way off is to jump. And I was always terrified, right? Always terrified, thought to myself, why did I just get in this line? And it's like that.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's like that. It's like, if we wait till we really know how to do it, we will never start. When I first started teaching about racism, I was 26 years old. It was 1980. Someone asked me to teach a class. I was at that stage of graduate education where you call yourself ABD, as an all but dissertation, and I needed some money, and I was offered this opportunity, and I said to myself, How hard could that be, right? And it was harder than I imagined, but it was also really empowering to bring together. I was teaching in California. It was a majority white teaching environment, though kids of color in the class as well. And at the end of the semester, my students said to me, this was one of the best learning experiences I've had at this university. Why did I have to wait till I was a senior in college to have this conversation? Everyone should take this class. That's what the kind of thing that people said. And it was so, and I will say that they said those things not because I was an expert, because I was not at that time, but because I think there was a great deal of power in doing this thing that you've been told all your life you're not supposed to do, which is to have a conversation about this important social issue. It was quite liberating for them, and I learned a lot in the process. And I tell that story to say, of course we want to do it well, and you don't want people to just, go off half-baked, so to speak. But at the same time, if we wait for perfection, we will never start. And if we don't start, we will be sitting here 20 years from now. And you'll be asking me,
Right,
in that vision, 20 years from now, I'll be 85, and I don't know how old you'll be, but we'll be talking. And we'll be saying, it hasn't changed. Because we have to be able to engage the conversation. So when you say, how can we start? Leadership matters, but I think leadership can come from all levels. Sometimes the conversation starts because students insist upon it. Sometimes the conversation starts because someone working on curricular issues says, if we're developing the next generation of leaders, how can they truly be educated if they don't understand this fundamental dimension of our society?
So one thing that comes up quite a bit, Beverly, I'm sure you've heard this, is that everyone wants to talk about race and racism, but doesn't appear to be a shared understanding of what racism is. And people may say, am I being racist? So is there something?
So in my book, people often ask me, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I'm more than happy to answer that question. And I try to answer it in the book, but that's not really what my book is about. Right. What my book is about is really the second half and other conversations about race. And so the book is really, I think of it as having three parts: what, so what, and now what. And the what is racism and how do we understand that? How do we talk about it? Let's define some terms. So what? So what does that matter in terms of how we think about ourselves and other people, in terms of our own identities and the identity development, not only of ourselves, but of other people? And now what? Now what can we do about it to interrupt the cycle of racism? But I tell you that by background to say the first section of the book is about defining terms, because it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation with somebody about racism if you're not sharing a definition.
Right.
So some people, when they talk about racism, are really talking about individual prejudices, right? So many people, as I say in the book, we are all exposed to misinformation about people different from ourselves. We're also exposed to misinformation about people like ourselves. There's a lot of, that misinformation comes in the form of stereotypes. It comes in the form of distorted information we learn in school and elsewhere. Some of what we think we know is the result of what we haven't been told, omitted information. And so all of us, I talk about that stuff, the stereotypes, the omissions, the distortions, as being like smog in the air. And nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'd like to breathe smog today. But it's the only air available. Exactly. So there you are, you're breathing it in, and if you breathe it in, you're gonna breathe some out, and it's gonna have an impact on your system. And so in the same way, we take in this misinformation, we absorb those stereotypes, we project them onto other people. So I bet someone in this room has heard somebody say, there's not a prejudiced bone in my body. Raise your hand if you've heard someone say that. When I hear people say that, I like to say, check again. Not because they're bad people, right, but it's impossible. It's impossible not to wherever you grew up, and I know not everyone in the room grew up in the United States, but wherever you grew up, I think it's an accurate statement to say you got misinformation about somebody. And that misinformation influences how you perceive those people, and that's what ultimately what fuels prejudice. But prejudice, racially based prejudice, is not the same as racism. Racism is a system. It's an innyism, right? It's a system. And the definition that I use in my book is racism is a system of advantage based on race. So if we are talking about interrupting systems of advantage, that's a different thing than talking about prejudice, right?
Okay.
They go together.
Yes.
They're not unrelated. And if we're talking about how those systems operate in the United States, there are groups that are systematically advantaged, groups that are systematically disadvantaged. The same thing is true if we're talking about sexism, or heterosexism, or classism, or ableism, right? That the ism systematically advantages one group, systematically disadvantages others. So if you think about racism as prejudice,
Yeah.
and if someone says to you, you are racist, usually the person hearing that feels like they've been insulted in
Right.
some significant way. I was talking earlier today about my work with teachers earlier in my career, and a teacher said to me, a white teacher said, if someone said I was a racist, I would feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. You know, it would be a real affront to my sense of myself as a human being. And yet, the fear of being called a racist in this particular instance was leading that teacher to behave in discriminatory ways.
How so?
She was afraid to give honest feedback to her black students. So she, so if you've got a classroom of kids and some of them are doing their homework and studying and some of them aren't, and in this particular example, some of you will appreciate, on this particular example, I was talking to a teacher who worked in the greater Boston area in a school that was a METCO school. And some of you will know that METCO is a voluntary desegregation program where black kids and brown kids too are being bused into suburban communities, most of which are largely white, all of which are largely white.
Right.
So you got, and most of the teaching staff in those suburban districts are white teachers. And so this white teacher has white kids in her class who live in the community, and she has kids of color, black and Latinx kids who are being bused from Boston. And when she's having concerns about the performance of the white kids in her class, she might do something like call the parent because she knows that mom, or she sees her in the grocery store, or that kind of thing. But when the black kid from Boston is not turning in his homework or giving her trouble in some other way, she's reluctant to call the mom or the dad in Boston. And when you ask why, this is a real conversation I'm recalling, when you ask why, she's like, well, if she might think I'm picking on the kid, he feels like I'm picking on him, and if I call his mom, she might say I'm being racist. And I said, if you don't call her, you are, because you're giving him the white kid is getting feedback and an opportunity to improve in a way that's different from what the black kid is experiencing. So in that conversation, just to finish the story.
Sure.
So in this conversation, so I said, well, what would happen? So let's imagine that happened. Let's imagine you called, and let's imagine that mom did say that.
Right.
How would you feel? And that's when she said, I'd feel like I've been punched in the stomach. And so I said, well, what, and of course the impulse would be to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, not a prejudiced bone in my body. Well, we already know that that's like a very defensive response, not the right response in moving this conversation along. But what if you said to that parent, or whoever it is, why do you think so? What did I do? What did I say? Help me out here, I don't know. It was not my intention. What was it about the thing I did or said that led you to think that? now you're in a dialogue,
Right.
right? That person has to say, well, it was because, you called me up. And I said, well, you know what? I called the other kids' moms up too. If I didn't call you up, I would feel like I hadn't done my job. Then we'd have a conversation.
Exactly.
But the fear
Yeah.
of the R word is paralyzing for some people. But if we understand that the R word really is describing a position, not a person, it's describing a position in relative to that system of advantage. It's not that people who are systematically advantaged are automatically jerks. That's not what it means. Right? But it does mean they're systematically advantaged.
One thing I thought you also were going to say about that, Beverly, maybe you can expand upon it, is it would seem that in a certain way, not reaching out to that particular student would be reinforcing some lowered expectations.
Absolutely.
That, well, you're expected to be that way. I don't have to kind of regard you in the ways I would regard
I don't
white
expect
students.
you
I
can
don't
improve.
expect you to can improve.
Yeah.
Right, so it kind of reinforces it in
Yeah.
two ways.
Yeah.
So you're encouraging us to begin, it sounds to me, shift the conversation so that people don't necessarily see themselves when they hear racism that you're calling them a racist, but rather you're describing, they may be prejudiced, right? Is that the idea?
I mean, there's a whole lot of language that is quite loaded, right? So when this happens to me sometimes because I write about race. Reporters, journalists will reach out, and let's imagine a highly visible public official says something offensive.
I wonder who that would be.
I'm just imagining. Imagining.
Me too.
So just imagine a highly visible public official says something that is pejorative about another group.
Right.
And then people will ask, do you think that person, fill in your favorite name, is a racist? I think that's a waste of time. I think that conversation is a waste of time. And I'll tell you why. Because and then usually what someone else will say, so someone will call me up and say, is so-and-so a racist? And I say, I really find this conversation a waste of time. I don't think it makes, I find no usefulness in trying to figure out, should this person be labeled a racist or should that person be labeled a racist? My question is that person or any person working to interrupt the cycle of racism? If you want to know whether I think that individual is working to interrupt the cycle of racism, I will tell you I don't think that. I see no evidence of it. But to me, that is the question. It's not like, who deserves the R label. The question is, who is actively working against racism and who isn't?
So as working against racism in that regard, would it be that you're looking for actions?
Yeah.
And is it also, so we could talk a bit about that. And also I would imagine, though, speech acts in a way,
speech is an action.
It's an action, right?
Yes.
And so while it may not be the same as supporting some sort of policy,
Right.
So you would want to make that distinction, I imagine.
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit. There's an image in my book that I talk about that people tell me they find helpful, and this is the image of the moving sidewalk at the airport, right? I'm going to assume, if you don't walk on it, you have seen it, right? Or the escalator, right? Something that's moving like on a conveyor belt. And here's the thing. If we think about the systems, the policies, the practices, the systems that have long been in place and are still in place that reinforce racial hierarchies, that reinforce messages about one group being more valuable than another group in terms of just their own humanity. That these systems of racial hierarchy, systems of advantage, have been in place a long time.
Right.
And they are, to a certain extent, self-perpetuating. You just have to keep doing what you always did, right? And it continues. So if we think about that as self-perpetuating and imagine yourself as stepping on that moving sidewalk, You might say, I've stepped onto the moving sidewalk of white supremacy or the moving sidewalk of racism in our society. And you might say, I don't like where this sidewalk is taking me. I don't like it.
Right.
So, but you might say, you know what, I like where this sidewalk is taking me. In fact, I'd like to get there faster. And so you start walking, right? You're walking with the moving sidewalk. You're accelerating your progress in that direction. But let's say, I don't like it and I don't want to go in that direction. I don't want to align. I'm not going to Charlottesville to protest. I'm not going to be one of those people.
Right.
I don't want to be actively racist. So what can I do? I can stand still. But if I'm standing still on a moving walkway, what is happening?
You're moving.
You're still moving, right? More slowly, but you're still moving. But let's imagine you said, okay, I don't want to go there. I can't stand still. You know what? I'm going to turn around. I'm not going to look in that direction. I'm turning around. Now what's happening? You're still moving. You're just traveling backwards, right? You just don't know where you're going, but you're still going there. The only way to interrupt that process is to turn around and walk fast in the other direction, faster than the cycle is moving. Got it?
Yes, I got you.
Okay, so the question is, each of us can figure out, well, where am I in this process? Am I walking fast with the cycle? Am I standing still? Have I turned around, but I'm passive, I'm not moving? The only way to really interrupt the process is to be active, and really active, because there's so much momentum already in place.
So I imagine a lot of people are thinking they want to be active and kind of want to know how. And we have a lot of folks here connected to institutions who would expect their institutions to be more active. So what can people do? How would you rate kind of how institutions are allowing people who consider themselves woke or trying to be to do the actions that you're describing? That is kind of going against the grain in a way. I mean, that seemed to be what you were suggesting.
Yeah.
A, how would you grade institutions? And B, for those who are interested in the room, what might you recommend that they do?
Yeah, so I think there are things that we all can do in our spheres of influence, right? That might be, as an institutional leader here at MIT or some other organization represented in the room. It might be in our own social groups. It might be in our neighborhoods. It might be in our homes. But to think about, okay, let me do an audit, right? So what's the audit? Well, let me talk in this context about the ABCs. Can I do that?
You can.
Yes, okay. So the A is perhaps the first part of this audit. I use this acronym, I call them the ABCs: affirming identity, building community, cultivating leadership. And the A, affirming identity, is fundamentally about just asking the question, who's in the picture? Who's in the room? And who's missing from the picture? So literally, if we think about this, let's imagine there's a camera back there, but let's imagine there was a camera up here taking a picture of all of you sitting here today, and you got a copy of that photo on your way out the door. What's the first thing you're going to look for? When you get this picture, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to look for yourself. That is the only answer, the only honest answer, right? You're going to look for yourself. So you were in the room, they took the picture, you've got your copy. Think of those, school pictures you took when you were a kid. You get the group picture, you look for yourself in it. And once you look for yourself in it, then you evaluate how you look, right? Was I smiling? Are my eyes open? All of that, you're going to look. When we enter into organizations, all of us, when we enter into the organization, we ask ourselves, am I in this picture? Where do I see myself represented? How am I represented? Some people will say, yes, I see myself. I was just cruising down a hallway with, I've been escorted around MIT today, and I won't even mention what the department was, but I saw pictures of all the faculty in that department and all the students in that department. And let me just say, I didn't pause to really study the pictures, but in my quick perusal, I saw there were some people missing, right?
It don't look like you and me, huh?
I'm just saying. I'm just saying. So the question is, who's missing from the picture? So you start with that.
Yeah.
So if I say who's missing, and I notice that there are some people missing, then the next question is, well, what can I do about that? How can I make sure that everyone feels welcome and as though they belong in this picture? You know, I was talking to I went to Wesleyan University as an undergrad, and I started in the class, I was in the class of 1975. I came to Wesleyan in the fall of 1971. Wesleyan had just gone co-ed. I was in the second class of women. So it was not a surprise, you know, to walk around and see, you know, pictures of male graduates, right? I mean, what would you expect in 1975 if no women had graduated yet? But fast forward, you know, 45 years later, you'd expect to see something different.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So the question is, what do we see when we enter into those environments? And if the picture, if we don't see ourselves included, and I don't mean just pictures on the walls, but I'm talking about in the curriculum, in leadership positions, you know, who am I interfacing with, and who is defined as belonging in this community, who is defined as not belonging. That's a fundamental place to start. I like to say, if you don't remember anything else, remember to ask, who's missing from this picture? And I want to give just a small example.
Yes.
Because sometimes they're just small things. So I was president of Spelman College for 13 years, and when I first arrived, I got there in August of 2002. And school is about to open, and we are going to be welcoming the class of 2006. So if you've ever been to Spelman, you may know it's a gated community, and you enter through the gates. And so near the gate, there's this big banner, and it says, "Welcome, class of 2006." One of the things that quickly came to my attention was that there were some people missing from that picture. And the people who were missing from that picture came up to me and said, "President Tatum, what's up with this sign?" Well, you might think, well, what's the problem with the sign? If there's a transfer student in the room, you know what's wrong with that sign. The transfer students are not in the class of 2006.
Right.
The transfer students might have been in the class of 05 or even 04.
Right.
And so if you've got a big sign that someone went to a great deal of trouble to put up to create a welcoming environment, and by the very act of putting up that sign, you've left out people, that's a problem.
Right.
Now the sign says, "Welcome, new students," right? And it, you know, but it's a different way of thinking,
Precisely.
right? It's a different
Yes.
way of thinking. So, but you'd be surprised that when you tell people we can't put up the sign that says class of fill in the blank.
Right.
It has to say new students. The people who've always put up that new 06
Right.
sign are like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
You know, of course, you know what I mean? We have to think in new and different ways. But if we do that A better, we do the B better, which is building community. Why would you put up a welcome sign? Because you want to build community. But by putting up a sign that leaves people out, you automatically make building community harder. Right. So if you want to do the B well, you have to think about the A first. The A comes first for a reason. The A, then the B. And the C, cultivating leadership, is about how do we work with the student, I'm thinking in the educational context,
Sure, yes.
the people but it doesn't have to be just students, but how do we cultivate the leadership of the next generation of leaders? Students who come to MIT are being prepared not just to be technologists, they're being prepared to be leaders in the fields in which they operate. And how can you be an effective leader if you don't know how to engage with people different from yourself? And you can't be an effective leader if you are regularly leaving people out.
Exactly. I wonder if we may go back, since you mentioned Spelman, I wanted to ask, you know, we think about racism and prejudices at majority white institutions. And I wonder if anything would be different at Spelman. I mean, would people think about racism differently, and how would it be talked about at Spelman?
Well, just as we could ask this audience to define racism, we might get a lot of different definitions.
Sure.
And let me just say a word about that. One of the reasons I go to great lengths to define the terms in my book is so that the reader knows how I'm using the term.
Right.
Which is not to say, some people read the book and they say, I don't like your term, I don't like how you've defined it. Okay, you don't have to. But at least you're clear about how I'm using it.
Right.
Right? It's been made clear. So in the context of a historically black institution or a majority, so-called majority-minority institution where you have the dominant group in terms of population is, in other contexts, a stigmatized minority, you would say, well, it looks different. And it does to a certain extent, but we all are breathing the smog. I
Okay.
just want to say that. So having grown up a young African-American woman in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, did not protect me from smog.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You know, and so this is all to say that people sometimes internalize those racist messages, and if you internalize them, you can still project that, you know, and that can take the form of colorism, for example, in a community of black people. It can take the form of classism and other kinds of hierarchies. But there is something that's very different, and I think it's important to say, even though, you know, there's no smog filter, right,
exactly.
over the campus. And that is when you step on the campus of Spelman College as a young woman of African descent, you are stepping onto a place where you can say, this place was built for me. From day one. It wasn't like I got added in later. You know, the founders of the institution in 1881 said, we are creating an institution that is going to create opportunity for women, formerly enslaved black women, who have not been denied access to education, and it is our intention to create an excellent, the founders, who are actually, I don't know if you know this, audience, 2 white women from Western Massachusetts, traveled to Atlanta, and they kept journals, which are in the archives of Spelman, and they wrote things like, you know, this is going to be the Mount Holyoke of the South. I mean, that's how they thought about it.
Right.
They referenced Mount Holyoke, they referenced Wellesley, they talked about that was their model of women's education. So there was always the expectation that there would be excellence at the core,
Right.
and for a student to come into an environment where no one says, well, we just let you in because we had to,
Right.
right? They said, we let you in because this place was built for you. That's a very empowering message.
Right, and it seemed to, at least while, as you said, there is no smog filter, at least that counteracts certain of the smog.
Absolutely.
So you talked a lot about the ABCs and about inclusion. And in the beginning of the book, the new preface,
Yes.
you talk a lot about the changes that are going on in the United States.
Yes.
And it seems to suggest that there's a lot that is showing that we need to be more inclusive, but seems not to be happening, right? Or
Yeah,
at least
not
there's a lot of
happening.
resistance to
Yeah.
it. So I wonder if you might say, but that seems to be a pretty important change in the 20 years that you've written it, which
Yes.
is the change in direction of the country, at least of late, that you described.
Yeah, there are actually 3 things that I'd like to talk about relative to the last 20 years. One, I call them the 3 Ps. One is population change.
Right.
Right? So if we look at the changing demographics of the United States, the population of color is rapidly increasing. Some of that is a function of immigration, and some of it a function of differential birth rates. But if we use 1954 as a marker,
Right.
I like to use it because it's the year I was born, but also, because the year of Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
You know, many people think of that as sort of a pivotal year in the civil rights struggle. In 1954, the U.S. population was 90% white.
90?
90.
Okay.
Okay, so if we had a little chart up here, that little pie chart would be almost entirely made up of white people. Just a 10% sliver, everyone else. Not black people, but black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, 10% of the population. So clearly, that's a different situation today. In 2019, particularly if we're talking about the generation of young people 21 years and under,
Yes.
that population is 52% white. And so rapidly shifting. If we looked at the whole population in terms of not just the youngest, but the whole population, according to the most recent census, the white population is about 67%. So if you include all the people, it's 67%. If you look at just the youngest people, it's 52%. So that tells you that the white population is, used to be 90, 67, now 52. It's shrinking in percentage, and the fastest growing population is the Asian American population, which is approximately about 6%, but it's the fastest growing. The Latinx population today, particularly if you're looking at that under 21 group, is about 25%. Black population in that under 21 group is more like 15, something like that. But it is to say rapidly diversifying. Right? So that's one change. And a lot of the rhetoric, I think, that we hear, particularly the anti-immigration rhetoric, I think, is fueled by white response to that shrinking graph, right? Some people are disturbed by that.
Okay.
I'm here to say, as always having been in the smaller part of that pie, you can do it. But having said that, that's the first P.
Yeah.
The second P is politics, right? And I just want to quickly talk about the fact that in the last 20 years, we've had 4 presidents.
Correct.
And the first president in that quartet was Bill Clinton in 1997. And in 1997, he was in his second term, and he launched what he called his President's Initiative on Race. Many people don't remember it because shortly thereafter, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, and the President's Initiative on Race got very little airtime. But when he announced it, he was at the University of Akron. It was December 1997, and I remember it because I was there. And he invited 4 authors to be on the stage along with other people, and he had read my book, and I got invited. Oh, wow. So there I am, and he's on the stage, and he's talking about why he thought 1997 was the time to really focus the nation's attention on race. And what he said was, we are a nation at peace, and we're experiencing prosperity, which gives us the cognitive bandwidth, it gives us the psychological energy to take on this tough issue. We're not at war with anyone, and the economy is doing well, and it's when we have those conditions that we should really try to deal with this long-standing dysfunction in our society.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, for his conversation, his leadership got derailed in that regard. Fast forward 2001, the year 2000, George W. Bush is elected as president. 2001 is when 9/11 happened, and then we were not a nation at peace, but a nation feeling attacked. And also during George W. Bush's tenure was when, at the very end of his term, the collapse of the economy in 2008.
Right.
So now we're at war and also no prosperity, worst recession in the history since the Great Depression. And then fast forward 2008, our President Barack Obama is elected, and something happened when he was elected, and that was victory was declared. We're post-racial.
We are post-racial.
Right.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
We've elected President Obama, first African-American. We don't have to talk about race because now we're post-racial.
Black president.
Right, exactly. So, and then fast forward, of course, it became very clear during his tenure that we were not post-racial. All of the shootings and police shootings and Black Lives Matter and, all of the incidents that really made visible in the age of cell phone video how much race was still important in the lives of Black people in particular, people of color more broadly, that, clearly was undeniable. And I don't hear anybody talking about post-racial anymore. Fast forward 2016, Donald Trump is elected president, and he launches his presidential campaign using racial stereotypes, articulating us-them language as a sort of a signature part of his campaigning and certainly his presidency. And so what we see in that process is the role that leadership matters, but also it brings us to the third P, which is polarization. And I think that today, most people would agree, we are more polarized than ever. And some of that, I think, is a function of the leadership that's being modeled, but also the challenge of the 21st century is that we have these rapid changes, not just rapid demographic changes, but rapid technological changes, a lot of things changing. And when a lot of things are changing, people feel stressed. And when they feel stressed, they want to turn inward and get defensive unless they're being encouraged to be expansive. This is why leadership matters. So speaking as a psychologist, people will often say, well, aren't we inherently inclined to categorize people? The answer is yes, we are. We categorize things. That's how our brains work. But, and not just people, chairs, tables, we categorize the world. But we also are social animals, and we follow the leader, much like wolves in a wolf pack, right? And so if we're following the leader, one of the things we look to the leader, and by leader, I don't mean just a president. I mean the leader of the family, the leader of the church, the leader of the school, the leader of the classroom. We look to the leader to signal who's in and who's out. And if the leader is signaling it's just us, everybody else is out, people follow that example. If the leader says, this is who we are, we're all in this circle, people follow that example. And so the context right now is one where we have a lot of the public, highly visible rhetoric defining the in-circle very narrowly and putting a lot of people outside that circle, and we have a lot of people following that example.
So, one thing reminds me, thinking about leadership, after the President Trump decided to pull the U.S. out of the climate accords.
Yeah.
President Rife wrote a letter to the community, MIT community. It said, leadership of the many. And he was talking about the ways in which all citizens who were concerned about climate change could themselves begin to be active.
Yes.
In certain ways in response to the decision by the president at the national level.
Yes.
So in certain ways, your remarks remind me of that, the idea
Yes.
that there needs to be leadership of the many and that people can decide in their own spaces to be the leaders that they want to see. So I wonder, just by way of conclusion, before we open up to the audience, to make sure that we get a lot of participation, and I don't get to hold you all to myself. One of the genius of the civil rights movement was the idea of trying to expand the circle of the beloved community.
Yes.
And to try to find a way for everyone to be in, at a time when many white people were saying, we don't want you in our circle.
Yes.
And it sounds like today we're coming up against a similar thing. But we're in the 21st century, where it appears now that the rhetoric of the civil rights movement sounds a little old, or maybe people think it's a little bit too conciliatory, or it's not of this age. So I wonder, might you give us what your thoughts are about what that inclusive language could be now? Would it echo the civil rights movement, or are you imagining something else?
Well, let me just say, so I've thought a lot about this, and it's still the month of April, and earlier this month we marked what was the 51st anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And of course, we saw a little clip from the movie just before this program started on the screen. And I recently reread his book, his last book, which was published in 1968, entitled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?
Right.
And if you read that book, which I recommend, one of the things you'll note right away is the dated language, right? There's a lot of gendered language, right, that we would perhaps write. I'm sure if you were alive today, he would have written it a little differently.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, he describes, the part that I want to lift up is when he talks about the line of progress is never straight. He talks about the fact that after every period of racial progress, there's been pushback against that progress. And there are other writers, contemporary writers, I think, who have say the same thing. But he pushed it, you push forward and then there's pushback. We see that, in terms of what happened in the South after Reconstruction as one historical example. But in 1968, he was describing the pushback against the progress that was being made. In 64, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, and now in 1968, he's writing about all the pushback against that progress. But if you think about the progress represented by the election of President Barack Obama in 2008 and some of the social changes that have taken place in our society, and then think about what Dr. King describes as the pushback against every period of racial progress, it seems to me pretty clear we're living in a pushback moment, right? And in that context, he says, what will cause permanent change? And what he says in the book, what will cause permanent change is not more legislation, not more laws, but really empathy. That you have to have empathy for that other, whoever the other is being defined as being. When you have empathy for the other, you take action. When you don't have empathy, it's because you've somehow dehumanized that person. And if you dehumanize them, then you don't care about them. You don't feel, they don't deserve your action.
Right.
Right? So how do you create empathy? This is an important question. And I think that at the end of the day, the only way to create empathy is to listen to another person, right? Which is about dialogue.
Right.
To engage in dialogue. And what's the difference between dialogue and debate? It's listening, right? When you're debating someone, you're waiting for them to stop talking so you can make your point, right? But when you're in genuine dialogue with someone, you're listening to their story.
Right.
But this is not a fast answer,
No,
right?
no,
or a
it's
fast
not.
action.
Precisely.
That the engaging in an empathic way requires sustained engagement.
Right.
And on some campuses, they are creating dialogue opportunities that are not just one-offs, not like come today and have a dialogue, but come and commit over several weeks to engage in difficult conversations where we may disagree, but you know what, I'm still gonna come back next week and listen to you, even if I didn't like what you said this week. So, and in that process, I'm gonna deepen my knowledge of your life experience, you're gonna deepen your knowledge of mine, and that empathy will hopefully lead to care and concern leads to action. If you think about what motivates somebody to take action, sometimes because they have some deep belief that it's the right thing to do, but most of the time, it's because somebody they care about is being impacted. I'm showing up at that meeting because my kid's in the school, right? I'm taking this action because somebody I care about is being impacted. And so if you can't create that empathic care and concern, you won't get any action.
Exactly. Reminds me of a comment. I was recently at a conference, and these were people who had been involved with reconciliation in South Africa.
Yes.
And regarding your remarks about listening, the person said, you have to listen so deeply that you are changed by what you've heard.
Yes.
Right? Because then even if you disagree, but that you're listening close enough that you actually can empathize
Yes.
and begin to relate. So it
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
And so when I say that, people will say, and you talk about, sort of the impatience of young people, people will say, like, I don't have time for that. Well, all I can tell you is you're not going to get it any other way. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
That at the end of the day, I also think it's important, and I live in Atlanta, and I try to, walk my own talk, but you have to think globally. I mean, same thing with sustainability. Think globally, act locally. So what's happening in your local space that needs your attention? That, you can't fix everything. I can't fix that Mueller report, but I can,
I knew it was going to come up.
But I can be engaged with disenfranchised communities in my local area and do something about that.
Well, it's certainly important about the empathy, as we've seen with this, the horrible actions taken by our government at the border.
Yes.
And family separation. And it's certainly clear that empathy is what's required. And for those Americans who are horrified by it, it has to be at some level seeing the people coming from Latin America as people.
Yes.
So why don't we open it up for questions and comments? I'm ready to share now. Mostly questions. When we say comments, but people say, oh, I have a question. But before the question, there's the comment.
If you could get to the question quickly.
That's what we would appreciate.
That'd
We have
be
two
great.
mics there, and it'd be great if you can identify yourself when you come up. Thank you.
Hello, so my name is Kevin, and yeah, I've identified myself. So the question
Thanks,
I'd like to
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, so your question? Yeah.
So the question I would like to pose is the question of politics per se, and perhaps the crude form it would take would be what would it take to address these sort of discontents, right, of representation and situations and preconditions and opportunities not being equal, what would it mean for politics to address them meaningfully? So in earlier US history, right, with mass parties, right, like say the Republican Party of the 1840s, 50s, and also the old Socialist Party of America, say in the 1900s and 10s, there was this sense that, okay, maybe like say black people could lead the fight for all stratus of society in the desiderata to fulfill bourgeois right that was promised with, say, the American Revolution and French Revolutions. But later on, you don't see this anymore in, say, society at large, right? There is a particularization, and particularly with, like, say, abdication of politics, with, say, community politics, with the Black Panther Party, et cetera, et cetera.
The question.
And so, right, so what opportunities do we have to learn from the 20th and 19th century for, say, the political party that is able to address the discontents you raised? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. So the first thing I would say is it helps to know some history. And what I mean by that is, when you were talking about, what was it that happened in the 18th century or the 19th century, even the 20th century, part of what I see as I travel around is that there are a lot of people who have no clue about what happened in those time periods. And so we don't learn the lessons of history. We keep repeating history because we don't know our history. And so I think it's really important. One of the reasons why the new version, the 20th anniversary edition of my book is so much longer than the earlier version is because I put more historical information in it. That was one of the things that I did differently. And one of the reasons I did that is because I got feedback from readers of the first version. Sometimes people would write to me, and I remember getting letters or emails from people who said, well, you said X, or you talked about the system of advantage, but like, where's the evidence, right? Like, where's the, And so I was like, okay, you want some, here's some more, But, we don't know that history, and as a consequence, we assume sometimes that things just, that neighborhoods are just segregated because people like it that way, as opposed to public policy that prevented GIs, black GIs coming out of World War II from getting loans in what were designed to be all white suburban communities, as an example. But in your question about politics, one of the things that I think about and I use as an example, after the 2016 election, I will say, after the 2016 election, I was a little depressed. And I, just kind of in a funk. Yeah. And so I was in this funk, and I was looking for hopeful signs. I describe myself as a professional optimist, meaning I am an optimist by nature, but I work at trying to find signs of positive progress, even when it appears that there aren't any. And so I'm always looking. So I came across this essay, which was really interesting, and it was written by a historian about what happened to the abolitionists after a major loss in an election. The Missouri Compromise that said slavery could go west and all of that was a major blow to the abolitionist movement. And and in her essay, this woman wrote this essay, it was in the Washington Post, and in her essay she said, well, what did the abolitionists do after they had this major electoral setback? Not unlike what the Democrats experienced in 2016. And she said the abolitionists had to mobilize and work, she didn't use this word, but they had to work on empathy. They mobilized and they put out handbills and they went door to door talking to their neighbors about the conditions of slavery and why it was so horrible, and to try to build more empathy for the enslaved Africans that they were trying to help through the abolition of slavery. So anyway, this is to say that kind of grassroots, person-to-person engagement historically has been shown to be perhaps the best strategy for bringing about social change. Numerically, we know that as the demographics change, the opportunity for cross-racial coalitions increases, right? Just from a numerical point of view. But that those coalitions require relationships, which brings me back to empathy. So, I think at the end of the day, it really is about that interpersonal connection. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nina Estrella Luna. I am a professor at Salem State University. I would like to say thank you, because this book completely changed how I teach race and ethnicity, all my race-related classes in sociology. So thank you for indulging my fangirling a little bit. But one of the questions that I have for you is, in the critical theory world in sociology and political science, there's a lot of discussion about changing the language and moving away from focusing on racism to changing to a focus on and using new language on white supremacy and whiteness, like really focusing in on that as the root. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that's fine. I think at the end of the day, that is the core issue, right? White supremacy and racial hierarchies. And so I think we should name that.
Hi, right here. Hi, I'm Hugo. I'm a visiting fellow here at MIT. I've also been trained at Harvard. So the question that I have is, what is the role that top academic institutions have to disrupt the systems of oppression? And the reason I ask that is because here in the US, prominent institutions such as Harvard and MIT pioneered eugenics and social Darwinism against Black people in order to keep them oppressed and in order to dehumanize them. Propaganda that later used Hitler to promote white supremacy, and it was actually built right here. However, based on what you said, I mean, MIT or Harvard, I don't see pictures that include me. I wonder what the top leadership is actually doing in these institutions in order to disrupt those systems of oppression.
Well, the question is, what are they doing or what could they do? And so, phrasing that question in the way that, that history is there, there's no doubt about that, acknowledging it, owning it, talking about it, why it was wrong, and what is different today is a conversation a leader could initiate if they wanted to do that, right? The first part of your question was, what's the role of elite institutions in this conversation? And I think it's important to say that what institutions like Harvard and MIT do become examples for other people. If you read the history of education, higher education, when Harvard said we're going to have this kind of curriculum, everybody else said, I guess we should have one of those too. The patterns that are part of higher education have been deeply influenced by institutions like this one and others. And so leading by example is important. Your observation about the history of scientific racism, to use the language of white supremacy, sort of reifying those ideas through eugenics and other things. I'm a psychologist. Psychology has a horrible history in this regard. You own it. You have to own it and say, here's where we went awry, and here's how we can try to do better in the future, in the current and in the present and in the future. So I don't think we have to shy away from owning that history. I don't mean owning it as in claiming it with pride, but acknowledging that's what it was, and that's not what we do now. But will people believe you when you say you don't do it now? Your actions have to match your words.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a grad student in the biology department. I'd like to ask a clarifying question about the definition of racism.
Sure.
And if I recall it correctly, the definition is something like a system of advantages based on race.
Yep.
I'd just like to ask, advantages with respect to what? Is it economic attainments or something like that? And as a related question, in your opinion, to what extent is the movement for racial justice to be a poor people's movement?
Okay, so the system of advantage takes many forms, and so I'm going to refer you to my book because we're not going to have enough time for me to tell you all the examples. But system of advantage based on race, is it economic? Absolutely. Is it educational? Absolutely. Is it access to healthcare? Absolutely. Is it access to, how the criminal justice, systems of advantage in terms of criminal justice and how it operates? Absolutely. Access to cultural influence and images, seeing yourself on television. I mean, we can talk about it in many, many examples. I'm going to give you, and that advantage starts at from birth, really. We can talk about access to healthcare at birth. I recently spoke to a medical school. I was at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and we talked about a report that was put out by the Institute of Medicine about, in the early 2000s, about almost 20 years ago, not quite, where doctors, the Institute of Medicine, pointed out that if you come to an emergency room with symptoms of a heart attack and you're African American, you're going to get different treatment than if you come in as a white person. You're less likely to survive that experience. That's just one small example. It's advantageous to be white in that emergency room in terms of the treatment. I could give you so many examples, we don't have enough time. Read the book. But having said that, could we focus on just poverty? Certainly there's an intersection between poverty and racism. We know that the poor in the United States, Black and brown people are overrepresented among the poor, but there's certainly plenty of poor white people. And if we were just focusing on class and not race, would that solve the problem? Research suggests it would not, right? Because that suggests that only poor people are impacted by racism. Even people who are not poor are impacted by racism. So, we could just talk about, the driving while black phenomena. That's not about poverty. That's about race, right? So, do we need to address economic opportunity? Absolutely, but is that the only manifestation of racism? It is not. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Tatum. How are you?
I'm great.
My name is Laura, and I work in, I do spiritual guidance and spiritual counseling. I specifically, for the last 3 years, have worked with white women around racism from a spiritual perspective. And we talk a lot about words, and that words are particularly important. And then I know that you refer to Dr. King, regularly. And so my question is, how do you see those of us who are in a more spiritual space, and religion has clearly changed since the civil rights movement, working together? Because a lot of the time, the pushback from different communities outside of spirituality, and the feeling, going into how people feel in the moment and taking, we are all part of the system. So if there's systemic racism, then you are part of that system and going within. How do you see those working together going forward?
I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
With the spiritual piece, or even religion and psychology, or the mainstream racial conversation. For example, I don't say white privilege, because privilege is, words are things. Privilege implies usually that there's something earned or deserved, whereas it's white advantage, and you're just given the advantage. There's nothing special about it, or fragility.
Yeah.
The behavior that fragility is describing is actually quite aggressive.
Yeah.
It's not, there's nothing fragile about it.
Understood.
And so when we shift, my experience over the last few years, when we shift that, there's progress made, but then when we take it out, and when I say we, my group of my students, I guess, there's a lot of pushback to then fit it back into a psychological definition when it may not necessarily have that.
Yeah, well, so if I'm understanding your question and listening to what you're saying, I'm hearing you say that in the context of the dialogue that you've been having,
Right.
The cross-racial dialogue that you've been having, that you have, you and the folks that you've been talking with have been using terms in a particular way.
Correct.
And that when you step out of those conversations, you encounter people who are using different terms. And the question is, how do we bridge those conversations?
Right. I'm asking, how do you see that working together? Specifically, because Dr. King was, obviously, he was a minister, and he was able to weave it together so well. But it seems like that is not necessarily the case so much anymore. Does that make sense?
Well, I hear I'm not sure I have a clear answer to your question, but what I do...
Just checking.
Yeah. But what I, obviously, Dr. King was very clear in his writing and his thinking about both, coming from a place of, we're all part of humanity, all God's children, using spiritual terms, coming from his ministerial background, but also very clear about the power of discrimination and what was, the ways in which people were being dehumanized. So it's not, I don't see it as an either or. I don't see it as an either or.
So
Now some people, not everyone who is concerned about justice defines themselves in the context of a spiritual community, right? And so sometimes there can be a sense of, because I don't define myself as in a spiritual way, maybe I'm not able to be part of that conversation, or vice versa, right? You know, and I think that those boundaries may be more translational than, may be more a function of needing to translate for one another. But at the end of the day, if you're concerned about justice, you're concerned about justice.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I'm raising a white 5-year-old girl right now. And it hadn't occurred to me that she might be encountering the concept of racism on her own.
Yeah.
Race, actually.
Yeah?
And I don't know whether I should be talking to her about it and what I should be saying. And to add to it, I come from a very racist family down south, so I have a whole lot of biases that I'm carrying around that
Sure.
and stuff that's going on in my head that I really don't want to talk to her about.
Yeah.
So that's my question. Yeah.
Okay. So here's my answer, and it's a short one, which is to say, in my book, there is a chapter, chapter 3, which is all about how to talk to young children about race. Should you talk to your child? Yes, you should. That's the short
Okay.
answer.
That one? That book?
That book.
Okay.
Yes.
Outside.
Yeah, that
Go
book,
now.
chapter 3. Yeah. But I also want to say, in addition to that book, chapter 3, there's a TED Talk that I did. You can find on YouTube, a TEDx talk. I did it at TEDx Stanford, and it's titled, "Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk?" And it's about the kinds of conversations you can have with 4, 5, 3-year-olds. Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Tatum.
Good evening.
And Dean Nobles. How are you guys?
We're good.
My name is Mark. About a year ago, there was an article in the Boston Globe. It ran from Sunday all week long, and it was about racism in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that kind of really got me was that the aggregate of white people in Boston and its environs was about 248,000, and that encompassed, you know, you poor people on the street to your richest.
Mm-hmm.
Guess how much black people were worth in
I
the
saw that
aggregate?
I saw that article, it was like $5.
$8.
$8.
Yeah,
$8.
$8. Mhm.
Hispanic people, practically zero. I think we probably owned a lot of debt, you know, so that we can seem like we are equal or whatever. And I wanted to know, what in the hell can you do to change something like that? Because that is very disturbing.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a long answer to that question, and I'm going to try to give a short answer. But if we just think about wealth accumulation and the history of wealth accumulation, you know, well, we can go back to the years and years of free labor, right? You know, and
Right.
how that builds wealth. Some people are working for free, and other people are benefiting from that. But even if you don't go back that far, if you just go back to, I'm going to go back to my father's generation.
Yeah.
You know, my dad was a World War II era veteran, and when he got out of the Army, he had access to a GI Bill. All the veterans did. And a lot of veterans went to college with that bill. And a lot of black veterans couldn't go to college with that bill because there weren't enough seats at all the HBCUs combined to provide access, and the other institutions were not letting them in, right? And then we could talk about access to the loans, right? The VA loans to buy houses. And I alluded to this. There's much more detail in the book about it. But if you couldn't get a loan unless you were buying new construction, and the new construction's in suburban communities, and those suburban communities have racial covenants so that they can only be sold to white people. Right. You know, and which, so now you're a black person with a, you know, trying to get a VA loan. To give you the magnitude of this, in northern New Jersey, 67,000 GIs got access to mortgages to buy houses. 67,000 white GIs got access to get mortgages. If I'm remembering correctly, the statistic is in my book, less than 100, certainly less than 200, went to black GIs. 67,000 versus
Jesus.
just a handful, right? And so you buy that house, and now your house becomes the equity for sending your kid to college.
Yep.
I mean, there's just so much that we could talk about just in terms of those two examples. So it's not a surprise to see differences in the wealth gap.
I know.
What can we do about it? Today, we can certainly think about, access to education. How do we reduce student debt? If you are a young African-American person or a Latinx person or, somebody coming from a low-income family trying to go to college and you don't have access to significant federal financial aid, you're going to end up with a lot of debt.
How do we catch up? If there's a such thing.
Well, I don't know that there. So I don't want to sit here and say there's no hope because, as you hear me say, I'm a professional optimist. But read this book, Reproducing Racism. It's written by a legal scholar whose name will come to me, but the title
Someone will Google it, I'm
is
sure.
Reproducing Racism. It's in the book. Is in the index. But this legal scholar talks about the laws and the policies that have created the wealth gap. And one of the things she says, she uses it, it's like the Microsoft, the monopoly that Microsoft had at the beginning, right? And then the bank, the court said, you can't do those things, those monopolistic practices, you can't do those things anymore. But by the time they said that, they'd had such an advantage over everybody else, they were able to maintain their advantage. Reproducing racism is like that. There are a lot of things that we do today that reproduce those early decisions that perpetuate the advantage, coming back to that system of advantage. How can you dismantle that? You can't without a lot of societal effort and commitment to doing so. But we can point to affirmative action as a policy decision made in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson to try to disrupt some of that, and we know where that has gone, right?
Yeah.
Resistance. So, when I wrote the prologue to my book, I talked about these things, sort of pushback against affirmative action, pushback against voting rights. We could talk about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act.
Which is pretty recent.
Pretty recent, and a pushback, and when did that gutting happen? After the election of President Barack Obama. And how did the election of President Obama occur? It occurred because there was a coalition between white voters and a lot of people of color. And it was a lot of people of color voting that made it possible for President Obama to win. But after he won, and after the Supreme Court ruled that, I'm getting into the weeds here, but there was a Supreme Court decision in 2013 that essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. And when that happened, states all across the nation, not every state, but many states started changing laws that made it harder for people of color and low-income people to vote. I live in one of those states, and I'm going to tell you, it is real. Voter suppression is real.
Yep.
And
I was raised in North Carolina.
well, there you go, the headquarters, right? The headquarters of voter suppression. And so all of this is to say, there is major pushback. I'm coming back to my point, Dr. King's point. After every period of progress, there's pushback, major pushback. And so when I was working on my book, I said to myself, this is depressing. It is depressing.
It is.
But, and so, for those of you who haven't read my book yet, I work very hard to give you some hope at the end. So if you're reading the beginning and it's depressing, that's because it is. It is. And so what can we do to change it? I think it will require a major institutional, by that institutional, societal commitment, which is why I say, think globally, act locally. I can't change everything, but I can change Atlanta. All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Holly Rockney. I'm one of the psychiatrists here in the counseling service, and I'm very much with you on kind of the core of this being empathy and about needing dialogue. My question is really having to do with what you're talking about around the geographic distribution of how the country votes.
Yeah.
In the context of sort of the media coverage, both kind of news these days and social media, where people just have such narrow channels of information or misinformation, and how can we think about dialogue and, person-to-person conversation as counteracting those forces?
Well, certainly social media is a challenge. We all know that it can be, there are many positive things about the use of social media in terms of the rapid spread of accurate information, mobilizing people to action. But at the same time, the rapid spread of misinformation and hate speech and, all of the negative things that we've been talking about. And so, to the extent that we can put our phones down and connect face to face in the communities where we are, I encourage that. I don't know that, but I also think that it's important to look at the ways that technology can still help people connect, right? So you can bring classrooms of, we have a lot of segregation in our schools, but you can connect students across lines of difference using technology. One classroom talking to another, as an example. So, I think that it requires more imagination, perhaps, than, we have right at this moment. But I think it is possible to build connections. I think about, I have two sons. They are millennials. One is 33, the other one's 37. They're on the sort of the front lines of the millennial generation. And I think about one of my children in particular who is very social, and he has relationships with people all over the world through his use of social media, right? And so that is to say there's opportunity, there's hazard, but there's also opportunity. Yeah. I think we're going to have to stop with these. So don't anybody else get in line.
All right. But one thing we may do too, excuse me before we begin, we might collect the questions and
Sure.
then you can answer. So I'll be responsible for doing a little.
Okay, so
Note-taking.
collect all the questions.
Yeah, and then you can
as
kinda
opposed to,
respond with them.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're going to hear 5 questions. And
Okay.
I'm going to say something.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here in this conversation. My name is Karina Gonzalez. I'm an Assistant Director of Diversity and Minority Affairs in the Division of Medical Sciences at Harvard. And as a mother of young twins, my questions are, what are your thoughts in terms of how to and when to start conversations about race and how to encourage empathy in young children, as well as how to encourage the school districts to have these conversations take place early on?
Thank you. We'll come back to all of the questions after we hear all the questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Beverly, I'm very appreciated what you shared today. I took a lot of screenshot of the live description. And so my question is based on what's happening right now and what you observed. What may we have your perspectives if we have a conversation 20 years from now? What do you think is the same? What do you think is the different? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a senior undergrad here at MIT. I really am inspired by you to have a lot more conversations about race, but I do think sometimes they can be, for me, very uncomfortable because I worry about saying something that's incorrect, or I have had some conversations where in big groups where people can get offended or someone can say something wrong. And how do you think the best way to facilitate a conversation like that is that you encourage so highly? Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Beretsky. I work here at MIT as a grant writer. My question is, what steps can we take to negate policies or systems that are in place that are just propagating racist, or not racist, wealth disparity, let's say. And I'm thinking about the public schools in particular. I live in Somerville, town of 82,000 next to Cambridge. And my daughter attends a school that has really big wealth disparity amongst the students. And I just see that the principal and the staff have to dedicate a bunch of resources to like social emotional supports for the kids, but they don't have enough. And that's always going to be the case in an urban district where you have a bigger concentration of folks without economic resources, supports at home. In schools in wealthier districts, the families can make up for what's not there. The schools spend everything they have. They don't have enough in their budget. The governor writes a budget, just, parses out the money. There's never going to be enough in the urban districts for the kids who don't have those resources at home. And what do you suggest we can do to try to equalize things for everybody? Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm Dominique Price Conley, and I work with MECO headquarters in the communities. And I just wanted to know, having these conversations, what are some of the things you found most helpful for people in the minority race that are allies for the majority race in helping them navigate privilege and safe spaces? Thank you.
Okay.
So you had three groups of questions.
Yes.
So a lot of them had to do with conversations, that is when and how to have conversations with young children regarding race, how to have them when a young student asked her discomfort but wanting to have these kind of conversations.
Yes.
And thirdly, this was about school districts and deal with disparity. And then finally, if you can give us your perspective 20 years from now, what do you imagine things would be? So you might want to leave that for the last.
Yeah. So let me start about the conversations with young children. So as I said to the other guy, the other person who was asking the question, it's not that you have to sit a child down and say, let me tell you about race. They ask questions. They notice difference and they ask questions. All of you thought of a situation that occurred, many of you thought of situations that occurred in your childhood, and yet you didn't discuss them with anyone. It wasn't that you didn't notice. Here you are, however many years later, you still remember it. Something came up that you could have talked to an adult about, but you chose not to, because you had been signaled in one way or another that this was not a conversation the adults and the environment were comfortable with. I remind you of that simply to say, kids notice things. Stuff happens. They have questions. And if you are signaling that this is not something we can talk about, 20 years from now, somebody will ask those same questions and the same hands will go up, right? So there are ways to do it. My book talks about how to do it and when to, how it naturally comes up with preschoolers. And so I would use that as a reference, but it also, in the book, I reference other people's work that you can also turn to. So I would just say, can you have these conversations with young children in age-appropriate ways? You absolutely can, and you should, and teachers should, and there are resources available to provide guidance. The conversation about, now fast forward, I'm a young adult, I'm a student, and I want to have these conversations and I don't quite know how to do them. Guidelines help, but time also helps, which is to say, it would be a fabulous thing if MIT had an intergroup dialogue program. There are lots of them around the country. Michigan is the model. They have, they're the home, that's sort of the headquarters of intergroup dialogue, but there are lots of institutions around the country that have done it. But here's the reason why committing to an extended set of conversations as opposed to just one conversation is because there's kind of an arc of discomfort, I'm gonna call it. When you first start these conversations, they do feel awkward. And if you stop because you felt awkward, you never get to the place where you can do it well. It's like taking an antibiotic. What do they tell you if they give you an antibiotic? It's a 2-week prescription. They tell you to take what? All of it.
All of it.
Right? But what we do about these conversations, we don't take all of it. We take a little bit, we think we've done it, and then we go home, and what happens? It comes back again, it comes back worse. And that's what we are doing. So you need to really do the whole thing. And when you do the whole thing, you actually get to a place where you feel like, that was the best learning experience I've had, exactly. Right? I mean, as my students told me at the end of the semester. But having these guidelines where, where you give everyone the benefit of the doubt, yes, people make mistakes, yes, they say things that offend each other, and they come back next week and try harder the next time. It's a learning process, and we all have to be willing to learn together.
And hopefully in 20 years, we'll be saying something different.
Hopefully in 20 years, I will be watching you all on live stream, having this conversation with somebody else who is talking about how much progress has been made. But whether that happens or not is really entirely up to everyone in this room.
Thank you so much. So you know what?
Yes.
Today, on this day, MIT has talked race. We have
Yes.
indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Tatum.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming.
Yes, we've got closing remarks. Cuello wants to say something. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, everyone. I'm the person standing between you and getting your book signed, so I'll be very brief. So my name is Cuello Poku, and I'm the manager for diversity and inclusion at the MIT School of Architecture and Planning. But before I give my final remarks, I'm going to make someone happy tonight. Someone is going to win this book. Okay, so who is it? Look right in front of you, the seat right in front of you. If you see a sticker, an orange sticker like this, you won this book. So who is that? Okay. Oh, so you're the winner, all right? Yeah, so if you see the sticker right in front of you, you're the one who won the book. So you see it? Who saw the orange sticker? Okay, all right. That. Come on. I feel like Oprah right now, like giving out. Let me first begin by saying thank you, Dr. Tatum and Dean Nobles, for an enthralling conversation tonight. Thank you both for your research, your commitment, your leadership when it comes to race relations and racial equity. Dr. Tatum, I know it's been about a year since we started this conversation of getting here. And as you can see, the conversation that we had tonight in this room and online, MIT's been waiting for a while. We're glad you made it. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I would like to finally just wrap up by saying a big thank you to a lot of people. You know, as I say, thank you to them, and thank you to individuals, departments, labs, centers, the Institute for the support and the partnership that we were able to come together across the Institute, different departments. As you can see, all the logos around, there's a lot of people, a lot of organizations. Thank you for your partnership. And finally, I want to really encourage each of us as we step out here to continue the conversation and to act upon the conversation convictions. And I'd like to share some few words from two people, Leonardo da Vinci and James Baldwin. Okay, so Leonardo said, I have been impressed with urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do. So something to think about. We have to step out and do. And Baldwin said, not everything that is phased can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is phased. So thank you for participating in the conversation here on online, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.